Imagine you are moving through total darkness. You are deep underground, squeezing through a limestone tunnel so narrow that the jagged rock relentlessly scrapes against your back and chest. The air is cold, stale, and incredibly thin. You aren't exploring, you aren't hiding from a predator, and you certainly aren't hunting. You are dragging something heavy. You are dragging a dead body. You are doing something that defies every single rule of basic biological survival. In the wild, a dead body is a massive, immediate liability. It is a biological beacon. It broadcasts a highly potent chemical signal to every predator and scavenger in a 5-mile radius that there is free, undefended meat available. If an animal dies in the wilderness, its herd members might briefly investigate, but then they move on. Survival dictates that you get away from the smell, away from the disease, and away from the teeth that are inevitably coming to claim the carcass. But you aren't running. You are dragging the lifeless body of someone you knew into a pitch-black, terrifyingly restricted cave system just to leave them in a specific, hidden room. This isn't a hypothetical horror story. This is exactly what ancient hominins did, and the evidence for it is genuinely insane. In a deep, dark space known as the Dinaledi Chamber within the Rising Star cave system in South Africa, scientists discovered something that completely broke the timeline of human evolution. They found the remains of an extinct, mysterious species called Homo naledi. At least 15 different individuals were excavated from this single, isolated chamber, representing over 1,550 individual fossil specimens. Here is the thing nobody tells you about this discovery. There is absolutely zero evidence that these bodies were dragged into the cave by predators. There are no tooth marks on the bones, indicating a big cat dragged them down into the dark to eat them. There is no geological evidence that they were washed in by a massive underground flood or a mudslide. Furthermore, no other animal bones were found in that entire, massive cave chamber, except for the bones of a single, solitary owl. The conclusion is as inescapable as it is baffling. These individuals were deliberately disposed of within the cave near the time of their death. Now, you might assume this was just a group of highly advanced, anatomically modern humans executing a complex funeral rite. But that's where the mystery doesn't just get smaller. It gets significantly weirder. Homo naledi lived roughly 335,000 to 236,000 years ago. They were a species that literally overlapped in time with our own early human ancestors. But they didn't look like us. They were relatively small, with a body mass and stature similar to small-bodied human populations today. But their brains were incredibly small. Their endocranial volume was tiny, much closer in size to the ancient, primitive Australopithecus than to any modern human. Yet their skull shape closely resembled early Homo species. We have always comfortably assumed that recognizing death, processing it, and performing deliberate, labor-intensive disposal of bodies required a massive, highly complex brain. We thought it was a feature exclusively reserved for the intellectual heavyweights of the hominin family tree. Homo naledi proves that assumption completely wrong. A creature with a brain a fraction of the size of yours was undertaking a highly dangerous, coordinated effort to remove their dead from the surface world and place them deeply in the dark. To understand why ancient humans started treating their dead with such specific, deliberate intention, we have to pull back and look at the brutal, chaotic world they were trying to survive in. Because the way our ancestors dealt with death was entirely forged by the absolutely terrifying way they had to live. Let's start from the very beginning. Go back millions of years. When your earliest ancestors finally descended from the dense, protective forest canopies and stepped out into the open, wildly expanding savannas, they had to adapt immediately, or face total extinction. Bipedalism, walking upright on two legs, was the ultimate survival hack for this chaotic new environment. It allowed early hominins to see directly over tall grasses, to spot stalking predators, and to travel incredibly long distances with remarkable energy efficiency. But this hack came with a massive, permanent physical price. To balance your heavy, vertical torso on two legs, evolution had to aggressively shorten and widen your pelvis, turning it into a structurally compromised, bowl-like shape. Your femur, the heavy thigh bone, had to angle aggressively inward for balance, and your feet evolved a rigid arch to act as a shock absorber. But freeing the hands unlocked a superpower. By 3.3 million years ago, hominins at a site called Lemekwi in Kenya were already making the first known stone tools. This was 700,000 years earlier than scientists previously thought. Using a sharp stone to slice meat from large animal carcasses, or using a heavy hammerstone to crush thick bones for nutrient-rich marrow, gave them access to a massive variety of calorie-dense foods. This immense dietary shift provided the heavy caloric fuel required to fundamentally alter the human body. For millions of years, this bipedal frame worked fine, and brain size increased, but very slowly. And then, the world went mad. Between 800,000 and 200,000 years ago, Earth's climate experienced an era of extreme, terrifying fluctuation. The environment swung violently and unpredictably between wet and dry, hot and cold. Evolution didn't just gently select the strongest hominins. It aggressively selected the ones who could adapt to unpredictable chaos. This concept is known as the variability selection hypothesis. To survive a volatile world that refused to stay the same, your ancestors desperately needed larger, highly adaptable brains. During this exact period of intense climate fluctuation, human brain size evolved at its most rapid, explosive rate. Over the long, brutal course of human evolution, the brain literally tripled in size. The modern human brain became the absolute largest and most complex of any living primate. But this biological miracle was a severe logistical nightmare. A large brain gobbles up a horrifying amount of energy. Even right now, as you sit there, your brain only accounts for 2% of your total body weight, yet it ruthlessly steals 20% of your oxygen supply and hijacks 20% of your total blood flow. But the massive energy demand wasn't even the biggest problem. The real, immediate danger was physical space. That shortened, widened, structurally compromised bipedal pelvis now had to somehow physically pass a massive, rapidly expanding human skull during childbirth. It was a terrifying geometric trap. Evolution had backed humanity into a corner where childbirth became dramatically more difficult and exponentially more painful than for any other primate on Earth. The birth canal simply couldn't get any wider without completely destroying the mechanics of bipedal walking and running. But the brain couldn't get any smaller, because supreme, highly adaptable intelligence was our only weapon against a chaotic environment and fast predators. The biological solution was a brutal compromise. Human babies had to be born early. They had to be expelled into the cold world, while their brains were still tiny enough to fit safely through the restricted pelvis. At birth, a human brain is only about 25% of its final adult size, whereas a chimpanzee baby is born at around 45% of its full capacity. This means human infants are born utterly, catastrophically helpless. They cannot walk, they cannot talk, and they cannot regulate their own body temperature. The massive amount of neurological growth that happens safely inside the womb for other animals has to happen completely exposed to the outside world for humans. This single anatomical bottleneck permanently and radically rewired the entire structure of human existence. Because a human infant cannot survive alone for even a few hours, the human species literally cannot reproduce successfully without extreme, highly organized social support. Ancient humans had to invent cooperative breeding. Childcare had to be distributed entirely across the extended social group. Grandmothers played such an incredibly critical role in keeping vulnerable children alive that human females actually evolved to live for decades past their reproductive years. This biological phenomenon, known as the grandmother hypothesis, proves that older, experienced women were so incredibly valuable to the survival of the group that evolution made them stop having babies just to help raise everyone else's. Aunts, uncles, fathers, and unrelated adults all invested massive amounts of their own energy into a single, fragile child. Ancient humans were embedded deeply in a dense, overlapping network of social connections. Every individual was a crucial, load-bearing pillar in the daily architecture of the tribe. Furthermore, the threat of total extinction was incredibly real. Between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, severe, prolonged climate shifts caused a massive population bottleneck that brought human ancestors incredibly close to being wiped completely off the map. The global population crashed, leaving only a tiny handful of survivors to carry the entire genetic future of our species for over 100,000 years. When your entire species is reduced to a fractional remnant fighting for survival in an unstable world, every single individual's life carries immense, irreplaceable weight. And that is exactly why death was so uniquely devastating. When a member of your group died, you didn't just lose a hunting partner or a familiar face. You lost a vital piece of the social machinery that kept your bloodline alive. You lost the memories of where the water was hidden during the last drought. You lost the knowledge of which plants would cure a fever and which ones would kill you in your sleep. For most of human history, infant mortality was staggeringly high. Best estimates suggest that in Paleolithic populations, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before the age of 5. Ancient humans were operating completely without germ theory, without antibiotics, and without modern medicine in a world filled with apex predators. But they did not just shrug off this monumental loss. The archaeological record proves that the idea of ancient humans being indifferent to death is a complete myth. At every turn, we see profound, deliberate mourning. We find infant burials in the dirt that are carefully, intentionally arranged. We find graves containing specific, meaningful grave goods and the remnants of ancient flowers. Every human culture on record has developed extensive ceremonies, protective charms, and naming rituals around birth, early childhood, and death. These rituals were not just primitive superstitions. They were sophisticated psychological frameworks designed to process unfathomable grief. They were engineered social mechanisms meant to bind the surviving community tightly together, publicly assigning responsibility and shared loss, ensuring the group didn't fracture entirely under the emotional weight of a child's death. And this deep behavioral reverence was absolutely not limited to Homo sapiens. Look at our closest extinct relatives, the Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis lived across Europe and Asia, surviving from roughly 400,000 down to about 28,000 years ago. They endured horrific, massive environmental shifts, living through violent swings between warm interglacial periods and freezing, brutal glacial ice ages. They had to constantly adapt their high-risk hunting strategies, tracking cold-adapted reindeer in the freezing glacial periods, and shifting to red deer when the world finally warmed up. They possessed enormous brains, reaching a maximum capacity of 1,200 to 1,900 cubic centimeters, which is actually larger than the average modern human brain today. For decades, pop culture treated Neanderthals as mindless, grunting brutes. But the fossil record tells a completely different, highly empathetic story. Neanderthals exhibited highly complex, symbolic behavior. They cared for their sick and their severely injured, and they deliberately buried their dead. Think about the physical mechanics of a burial for a second. When you bury a body, you are burning highly valuable, hard-to-replace calories. You are spending precious time and energy digging into hard, rocky, often frozen earth, instead of actively hunting or foraging. You are taking a massive physical risk by staying stationary and distracted in prime predator territory. You only do that if the body means something profound to you. When we look at anatomically modern humans, the evidence of intentional burial becomes even more undeniable. At the Kafse cave site, archaeologists uncovered what is widely considered the oldest known intentional burial. Imagine the ancient scene. You don't just walk away from the cold body of someone who helped you survive the brutal winter. You dig deeply into the earth. You place them deliberately. You are making a permanent, physical mark on the landscape that loudly says, "This person mattered." As human brains reached their modern capacity and human societies became incredibly complex, the way we treated the dead evolved rapidly alongside our primitive technology. Remember, the environment was still wildly, violently unpredictable. To survive, human groups couldn't just rely on their immediate local family. They had to build massive, extended social networks. We know that by around 300,000 years ago, ancient humans in southern Kenya were trading highly valuable, razor-sharp obsidian across distances of up to 55 miles. By 130,000 years ago, hominins were exchanging critical materials over massive distances of over 300 kilometers. These ancient trade networks weren't just the prehistoric version of Amazon delivery. They were vital, life-saving survival alliances. Trading sharp obsidian and exchanging physical gifts cemented deep social bonds between distant, unrelated groups, effectively mitigating the devastating effects of local famines and brutal droughts. If your valley completely dried up, you could desperately rely on the social ties you built with a group 50 miles away to share their hidden waterhole. Survival became deeply, permanently tied to communication and abstract social contracts. And as these networks expanded, humans fully developed the ultimate cognitive weapon: symbolic communication. The archaeological record clearly shows that the human capacity to use abstract symbols goes back at least 250,000 years. Ancient humans began using pieces of preserved pigment, like bright ochre and manganese, to deliberately color objects and their own skin. They created ancient shell beads, carved bone discs, and intricate jewelry to instantly convey complex information about their specific group membership, their social status, and their identity to strangers. In the Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found a deliberately engraved ochre plaque dating back roughly 77,000 to 75,000 years. This explosion of early art and complex symbolism is intimately tied to exactly how we treated our dead. When you have a brain capable of taking a simple piece of broken shell and permanently assigning it a meaning of high status or deep love, you have a brain capable of looking at a lifeless human body and seeing a soul. The use of these symbols is ultimately connected to the supreme human ability to plan ahead, carefully record information, and vividly imagine. It allowed ancient humans to effectively imagine a world beyond the immediate, brutal present. It allowed them to conceptualize a lingering spirit, a lasting memory, or an unseen afterlife. When ancient humans carefully arranged a fragile infant in a shallow grave and gently placed a flower or a carved bone disc next to it, they were utilizing the exact same cognitive software that allowed them to build sharp spears and map the night sky. They were taking a physical action to assert control over a chaotic universe. They were making a statement that said, "This specific object has meaning, and this specific person has meaning, and neither will be forgotten by the group." And we weren't entirely alone in this cognitive leap, even if we were the most successful at it. Modern non-African humans actually carry about 1.5 to 2.6% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes today. We absolutely interbred with them. We shared the dangerous landscape with them for tens of thousands of years. While Neanderthals were highly capable and endured extreme cold climates, they typically didn't exchange materials over the massive, continent-spanning distances that Homo sapiens did. They occasionally produced symbolic artifacts, but modern humans possessed much broader social networks and far more specialized tools, allowing us to eventually expand our range globally, while the heavily muscled Neanderthals went completely extinct by 28,000 years ago. We survived because our connections were wider, our networks were deeper, and our shared rituals bound us together across impossible distances. So, what did ancient humans actually do with their dead? They didn't just abandon them to the waiting scavengers. They didn't just view them as dangerous biological waste. From the tiny-brained Homo naledi dragging their fallen kin into the pitch-black depths of the claustrophobic Rising Star cave system, to the heavily muscled Neanderthals burying their companions in the freezing, unforgiving dirt, to early Homo sapiens painting the deceased with bright, symbolic ochre pigments, our ancestors dedicated an irrational, seemingly dangerous amount of energy to honoring the dead. They carried them. They buried them. They mourned them. They created elaborate, community-binding rituals around them. In a world where merely finding enough calories to survive the night was a daily, grueling struggle, where fast predators constantly lurked in the tall grass, and the climate could turn lethal on you in an instant, early humans looked at the dead and collectively decided that memory was worth the immense effort. The next time you walk past a modern cemetery or attend a quiet funeral, don't just see it as a collection of stones or a polite cultural tradition. See it as the continuation of an ancient, stubborn biological rebellion against the harshness of nature. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, long before agriculture, long before written language, long before cities or nations, your ancestors decided that a human life had a distinct value that extended far beyond a heartbeat. They looked directly into the dark, terrifying expanse of mortality, and they chose to care. And that simple, exhausted act of carrying a body into a cave might just be the most profoundly human thing they ever did.